There we go. There we go. I figured it out. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. The Office of Warren County Cultural and Heritage Affairs, a division of the Department of Land Preservation, would like to welcome you to Preservation's Webinar Part 2, Paper-Based Collections, with our presenter, Gary McGowan. Gary is the President and Principal Conservator of Cultural Preservation and Restoration located in New Jersey. He holds a Master's of Museum Studies with a concentration in conservatism from the State University of New York. Mr. McGowan has over 30 years of experience conserving a wide variety of materials, including decorative and fine arts, archaeological and ethnographic materials, and historic monuments. He attained the distinction of Professional Associate from the American Institute of Conservation and Historic and Artistic Works, and is President Emeritus of the New York Regional Association of Conservation. Today, Gary will be discussing the methods of preservation of paper-based collections, and will focus on a variety of things, including photographs, prints, and documents. So in the near future, this webinar series, both part 1, which was about the basics, and part 2, paper-based collections, will be made available on the county's YouTube channel, and I can certainly email it to all of the groups so that they can view it. So in order to cut back on feedback noise, as I asked before, only unmute your microphone when you have questions that you need to ask. And again, thank you so much for participating in this webinar. We really appreciate it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the PowerPoint back up. Gary, let me know if you see it.
I do.
Okay, this time I'm going to do it that way.
Great, good.
So all right. So anyway, I will let Gary take over from here.
Thank you very much, Gina. And thank you, everybody, for attending on this snowy day. If everybody can just give me a thumbs up that they can hear me, just to make sure. Excellent, terrific, good. Susanna, can you, I can only see the top of your head. I hope that, can you hear me? She's spinning, but all right, I'm just going to continue and going on, and hopefully everybody can hear me. So the last time we met, I was discussing a lot of the basics of art storage, handling, long-term storage and care of collections. So today, focusing on paper-based or canvas-based objects, because I will be talking a little bit about paintings. I'm going to present case studies for everyone to see, and I hope that this will elicit some questions about proper storage and handling, what you may encounter in your own collections with your own materials, either paper-based or photographs, paintings, what have you. So in the past, we talked a little bit about storage for paper and pastels, photographs. There are many different systems out there. You can look in Gaylord Archival or a variety of companies that provide flat storage or box storage. Really, a lot of the decision making about storage of paper-based products is what your conditions are in your facility and your physical conditions or monetary conditions with what you might want to invest in. I'm a very strong proponent of flat storage, file storage for prints, photos. I'm not a great fan of stacking up of images, whether they're photographs or pastels, in folders. I know there's a lot of systems out there for stacking photographs in binders or in folders. I don't think that they're very effective as a means of storage because there's not enough support behind the object, or the photo or print, what have you. And I think there's too much chance of damage being carried out on an object when you have that type of storage. So that being said, I guess I'm going to jump into these case studies, and then hopefully this will elicit some questions back to me. What I'm going to show you are projects from a variety of clients that I have had in the past. And this first slide up here is a woodblock print, a Japanese woodblock print. Now, initially, on examination of this particular piece, there were some condition issues. Once we started to work on this object, there were many more concerns that developed on how it was being framed, how it was being handled. So when you start on a project like this, and I'm sure you have these experiences with your own collections, you start looking at something based on, you might see a tear or a fold or an improper handling or a storage issue, and it leads you down a rabbit hole of many, many other issues being raised while working on a piece. So initially, this woodblock print was looked at for mold, and if I could have the next slide, Gina. Thank you very much. So this has a silk mat that surrounds the woodblock print, and I should state that the print is actually made on rice paper, so very different than the rag board that the mat was made from. So this is a silk lined or silk faced mat, and you can see in the corner here that mold has developed. So that's beneath the glass cover plate and on the mat itself. So now this brings the question is, well, if it's on the corner of the mat, is the woodblock print in any jeopardy of further damage due to this black mold? And indeed, yes, it is, because as mold spores migrate around the object, it could settle on the print itself and start growing there. So our initial investigation of this piece was to deframe it and to deal with the mold. So if I can get the next slide. This is just an area, another close-up up at the top, and okay, of the mold. And now this is the bottom. You can see where the print is surrounded by the silk mat. The edge of the mat is showing a little bit of coloration change to this sort of yellow, which would also indicate that there might be issues with the board that the mat was cut from, and not necessarily archival. So you can see I'm building sort of a detective story around what I see when I'm doing this initial assessment. So we started looking at the mold, but now I question the mat, the historic mat that was used. Is it archival? And what issues might be presenting themselves? So next slide, please. Now, up at the top of the print, this is the slide is actually sideways. I apologize, but you can see that there's a great deal of cockling where the rice paper, the paper itself, has reacted to humidity in the room or in storage and has caused the print to have this undulation. So although it's being held in place in the frame by the mat, it clearly is not supporting the print enough. So now we have distortion of the print. So with changes in humidity being high at times and very low at times, this cockling of the print has occurred. And through time, those deformed surfaces can just continue to accelerate or make it more difficult to remove in the future. So next slide, please. So this is just a close-up of the beautiful work by the artists, and this is a very early print. This is a 18th century Japanese print, so it's quite old, and it was originally quite colorful. You can kind of see some of these pinks coral colors that would have been very intense originally. The black being mostly an iron-based ink. It's much more stable than some of the other inks that have faded. And again, looking at the print, we can sort of see that it was stored or exhibited in an area that was not conducive to the inks and has caused a great deal of fading. So the glass was not an archival glass. It did not have any UV protective qualities of the glass. So in reframing, that would be something that we would look into, is changing the glass to a UV protective glass that may help maintain some of the rich colors that unfortunately in this particular piece have all but faded. Next slide, please. This is the verso, or the back of the framed piece of the print. And as part of your evaluation of your objects, or in the case this one, we're looking at the type of backing. Was there a dust cover to prevent dirt and debris entering into the back of the frame? So this was purported to be professionally framed, although you can see that they used a sticky back brown adhesive tape to seal the back of the print, and it is not archival. So even with the best of intentions, with some of these framing individuals that carry out framing, they may not be using the most archivally correct or archivally stable materials. So we look again at the, oh, okay, perfect. Somebody else has joined. Great. We look at the types of materials that had been used, even the hardware, the hanging hardware, to evaluate those issues. And I will show you a close-up why, again, this hardware was incompatible to the system that they had for this very narrow frame. It's a bamboo frame. This is just a close-up of the catalog number and the date range of the piece. From 1759 to 1817 was this workshop working to create these prints. So if I could have the next slide, please. This is just a corner showing how that tape had been applied. Instead of a traditional dust cover, which would not have been glued to the backing, but would have just had an adhesive around the edge of the frame, and the cover would have floating on the back. This is actually a series of tape segments. You can see the seams just applied and glued to the back. Not only was the paper not archival, but the adhesive often used are not archival. Next slide, please. Here's where the hardware, the hanging hardware, was incorrect. It's a very narrow, if one can look and see in the photo, the very narrow strip of wood that is the frame. This eye hook that was used is very, very large, too large for the frame. And the hanging wire, frankly, is probably designed to hang something like 100 pounds worth of weight of a frame. So very, very robust and overkill for this particular piece. And because the eye hook was so large, it actually damaged the frame. When they screwed it in, they weakened and split some of the wood. So again, even these little areas to investigate when you're working with collections and looking at collections, to see if the hanging materials are appropriate, or if there's different hanging hardware that would be more sympathetic to the artwork, or is something like a dust cover incorrectly applied, or is the mounting material on the back correct or incorrect. Could I get the next slide, please? So there again, you can see these strips of paper. We've removed the hanging wire. we're evaluating the deterioration or the damage that was carried out on the frame itself. And none of these are archival materials. Can I get the next slide, please? So now what I'm showing you here is we're just now investigating the back of the artwork by slowly cutting away with a razor blade or a scalpel to cut the back off, because again this was glued down. In these situations, I recommend wearing nitro gloves. Archival quality cloth gloves are fine. I find them a little bulky. I find them a little difficult to work with because I lose some dexterity and sense with thick fabric gloves. So I prefer the nitro gloves. You don't want to wear ones that have powder or anything applied to them. I don't like latex. They don't hold up very well, and I don't recommend vinyl. So you can get nitro gloves at any drugstore. They usually come one size fits all, or you can go through one of the companies like Gaylord that provide archival materials, and you buy, a box of gloves. But to this point, I wouldn't be wearing gloves necessarily because I'm just examining the outside surface. But as soon as I start to open an object up like this from the back side or really examine the artwork itself, I'm always wearing gloves. It's just good housekeeping and good hygiene to work with. Next slide, please. So now it's difficult to see what went on, but we've actually removed the print out of its frame. It still has the glass across the top, and it still has the backing board to it. So you're just looking at the face, but it's out of the frame. So when dismantling an object like this, you have to be very mindful of things that may have shifted during framing or adhesives. And when I show you some of the other objects that I've worked on, some of the things I've encountered. So sometimes you find all kinds of odds and ends. Newspaper is a real common one to be shoved in the back as a support, which causes all kinds of damage and deterioration. But sometimes you'll find tape and other fastening devices inside. This, fortunately, was pretty straightforward, but we're now starting to remove the material so we can get to the mold. Next slide, please. So there's a close-up of just the mold on, again, the silk mat. So the mat itself is just rag board, which is a cotton rag, and it's a combination. It's wood pulp and cotton. It's not a full rag board, but it wasn't nearly as bad as I have seen for acid production. So if you have a mat or a backing board that is straight paper pulp, that's when you really tend to see acids released through time. And that's something that in your own collections you should evaluate. And it might be prudent in some instances to change out if you have historic framed artwork where you might have backing boards or mats that are pure wood lignin paper and might be producing acids that outgas and can actually burn the object. This is very notable when you see these brown lines where mats end and artwork begins. Sometimes when you demount an object or unframe an object, you'll see these hard lines, and they're brown due to the acids migrating and literally burning the object. So we didn't have as much of an issue with this because this rag board had a pretty high cotton content, so it wasn't very acidic. But you see the mold there. Next slide, please. That's just another one with the mat, but we can move on. Next one, please. So now what we've begun the treatment is we're doing Hepa vacuuming, and I think we talked a little bit about this in the last webinar, that if you don't have one of these, I would highly recommend getting a Hepa vacuum system. It really has to be a true Hepa vacuum. I did supply some names of vacuum systems. They can be quite costly, but it's a well worth it, a good investment for an institution or a historic home to have. These little micro vacuuming tools are easily acquired at, they're like 25, 30 bucks. Actually, for those that are close to Hackettstown, there's the vacuum store on Main Street. He sells a nice little kit that has a whole bunch of attachments. The kit has a reducer to reduce the actual suction, because you don't want to use a vacuum system directly on the artwork unless you can control the suction. You don't want the suction too high. You want it just to be able to dislodge or remove the debris without pulling or causing any abrasion to the surface of any artwork, whether it's a Japanese print or even a textile for that matter. So you want to be able to use the reducer which comes with the kit, or at least have a vacuum system that you can control with a rheostat. We started vacuuming the mat to remove the mold, and then we eventually will, I don't have necessarily a slide of this, but we moved on to vacuuming the surface of the print. Because if you have mold in your collection, which it's quite common, it's an easy thing to run across. You have to consider that it's throughout the object. It's not just in the localized little colony, but mold spores can be distributed throughout the artwork. So as part of dismantling this piece, we vacuumed both the mat and the artwork. Next slide, please. So now these are some of the things that we encountered on the Verso that we did not necessarily know we were going to encounter. And I bring this to your attention because I think as you work through your own historic collections, you may encounter these types of scenarios. This was, quote, professionally framed, and they utilized a correct system by hinging the artwork. So what you see there are these two pieces of tape that create a hinge at the top of the woodblock print. And then for some reason, I'm not really quite sure what the framer thought this was going to do, but he also created a mitered tape border around the mat, I guess for extra support. It does nothing really to help or protect the artwork. So again, that's something that we encountered, but really didn't do anything for the print. So again, I said that this was professionally framed, although the concept of hinging a print is correct. He just used a tape and literally glued it to the top of the print, which I would never do. In conservation, we would use something like wheat paste, which is completely reversible and easily undone, and would not interact with the print. So can I get the next slide, please? So what I'm showing you here is I cut away most of the hinge from the actual print. And now what I have to do, because I can't go at it with any type of solvent that would easily remove the adhesive, and I don't want to bring any water close to the artwork itself, I have to mechanically slice off very carefully to use a scalpel underneath the corner and shave away the hinge. And then I will put a hinge that is affixed to the actual woodblock print using nothing more than wheat paste, which again, very, very reversible. And in conservation, we try to use materials that won't affect the object or cause any damage going forward, and also have the ability to be easily removed. So, for instance, if I put a hinge onto this print and then we wanted to remat it or reframe it in the future, the hinge could easily be removed. Where this, I now have to struggle with trying to get this pressure adhesive off the back of the print. So these are things, again, for you to think about in your own collections, is what you may have inherited by someone giving a donation, or a collection that has been with, say, a house museum for a very long time. That's where this sort of detective or forensic sort of analysis of what you have within your collection is so critical. Can I get the next slide, please? So the next, I guess, let's see, the next two slides are really just showing the actual print now, and that we're going to start to do rehumidification, which is something that I would not recommend anyone that is not trained as a conservator to carry out. Sometimes dyes or inks can be water sensitive. The paper can be water sensitive, and it has to be done in a very systematic, controlled way. But we'll be blocking and flattening this print again because of the type of framing that it had was not really adequately supporting the piece. So once we're done, it will be flat and reframed. Can I get the next slide, please? Again, that's just at the top. You can sort of see this cockling where it was moving because of excess humidity when it was in the frame. Those two little, you can kind of see where the hinges were at the top. They're still poking at the top there. That area was held in place, but the rest of the print was able to move. And as there was excess humidity, it started to swell. And then as the humidity drops, it starts to shrink again. And then you get this cockling or undulation. So that's just one little object that I've worked on with paper. But just to show you the variety of things that you may encounter within your own collections, and to try to develop a systematic approach to, if you're going to do any deframing or swapping out removal of old materials like old frames, old framing materials, backing boards, hanging wires, etc., that there are all of these things to consider. So if we can just go to the next case study. I should also ask before, with just that particular print, if it emoted any kind of question about something that might be in your collections. I know at the end of my presentation, we're going to open it up for discussion. So if you want to hold those discussion points, or if there's something that you really wanted to throw out right now, we could, talk about that before I go on to the pastel. I don't know if anybody has anything to say. No? Okay, I guess on to on to pastels. So I just again show you this case study. This was a series of pastels that I worked on for the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR. And this hung in a house museum for well over 100 years in that space. It eventually becomes holding of the DAR, but it is a pastel done on paper. So it is a wood pulp paper. It's not rag. So right there we have some issues with the actual substrate or the paper itself. So one would describe this as having inherent vices within the object itself. So again, if this was in someone's collection, you would have to be extremely mindful of the humidity and temperature with a piece like this, because the paper is not stable by itself, let alone the pastel that was applied to the surface. So it has inherent vices. Clearly, when the artist made this piece, he wasn't concerned about longevity of the artwork or using archival materials. So it was just what the artist felt comfortable with working with. So this portrait of a woman, it's mid 19th century. If I can get the next slide, please. This is just a close up. You can sort of see some of the wrinkling of the paper below. You can also see abrasion on some of the surface. Again, this comes back to how it was properly framed, or improperly framed, I should really say, is that this particular pastel had no mat around it, nor did it have any lifts underneath the glass. Typically, if you are framing a pastel, you would want a small area between the glass and the artwork so that you would avoid uh, uh, rubbing and or abrasion. And that abrasion can really occur just by people walking wall moving a little, the floor moving a little, or if it's in an area where vehicles are driving by. It does not take much for this repeated movement to cause some rubbing and or abrasion to the surface. So if I can get the next slide. This is just up towards the top. You can sort of see some old water damage, which is something else that you may encounter in your collections. This is that long vertical drip to the proper right-hand side of the portrait. This again was improperly stored, and there was some water that got between the glass and the frame, the pastel itself. So in these situations, you would again have to look at what conservation could do to mitigate those types of those conditions. Um, be advised, please, that this particular piece does not have any surface coating or fixative. There was nothing used to hold the pastel to the paper except for the actual physical pressing of the pastel chalks into the paper itself. So there's no adhesive, there's no fixative on the surface. So historic pastels are prone to this abrasion. And if you can see up by her hair comb and that water drip, that sort of light patch where there's been a fairly extensive loss of the pastel. Next slide, please. Again, this is just a close-up of some of the pastel work in her lace collar. And again, some abrasion up in that mid area where the glass has rubbed the pastel right off. Next slide, please. So here's the verso, here's the back of this. And this poor little piece has seen many, quote, repairs by well-meaning restorers. One of the restorations in the past was to repair a tear at the bottom, and they just literally used masking tape. So this is something you may indeed encounter in your own collections, or if new materials come into your collections through donations, it's possible that you may encounter these types of pressure tapes. Again, I would say that in a situation like this, that you would seek out a conservator to deal with this, because this is a very, very difficult project undertaking, because these pressure tapes are applied to a very unstable paper, and in many instances, there's no way of chemically or solvent removal. You have to then mechanically remove them, and then deal with the inherent tears that whoever was fixing this slapped the tape on. You can see that there was a dust cover over the back of it that for some reason someone tore off a section, exposing the tape. So again, these sort of detective situations where you're looking from either the front or the verso, and going through these different layers, these different historical events of when things may or may not have been repaired, if they were done correctly or incorrectly. Interesting to know, this had a historic frame with a relatively new hanging wire, and the wood from the frame was actually so deteriorated through time that it lost its structure where the eye hook was threaded in, and when it was on the wall, it literally fell off, causing a very large tear down the side of the portrait. Can I get the next slide? That's just a close-up, and you can see this tape. The tape has yellowed again because this is not acid-free. The adhesive, this pressure adhesive, also produces a series of acids. Sometimes these are easily removed. Sometimes it's very, very daunting. Next slide, please. This is the backing paper, which again was not archival and is crumbling. Next slide. So this is just two portraits, two images of the same portrait after conservation. If you can see, that watermark has been removed or reduced, so that's gone. Some of the abrasion, we did some pastel work to infill some of the loss. There was a large tear that ran down from her hand and arm up towards the top of her head. We fixed and repaired that after it had fallen off the wall. So again, I bring these techniques or treatments that I've done on this particular piece to sort of illustrate that you may be inheriting or working with collections that are not stable, that require treatments, and you won't really know until you investigate the materials that were used. In this case, we actually applied a felt lining around the edge of the frame where the print, or the pastel in this case, fits in, so it gives a little bit of support and a little bit of protection from abrasion. So there was a felt lining that ran around the historic frame, and this also gave a degree of cushioning or lift away, so that the glass would not come in direct contact with the pastel. In that way, we would reduce or minimize any loss of the surface through abrasion, as having any more of the pastels fall off the surface. I did not carry out any consolidation or use any fixative because that would be introducing something that was not originally used by the artist. But we did try to compensate by putting those lifts in to separate the glass from the pastel. So again, those are things that you might be able to do in your own collections, is to retrofit historic frames where you want to use the historic frame, but you know that it's causing some deterioration or damage to the artwork. So you can do some retrofits, or in some instances, it's actually much better to reframe the piece and keep the historic frame in your collections as a reference piece or as something that could be married back for a particular exhibit, but it is much better for the object to be maintained apart or in a new framing system. So can I get the next slide, please? So now I'm just going to move on to something completely different. So this is obviously not paper. This is a painting. This is in a collection in Paterson, New Jersey. This is a mid-19th century oil painting on canvas. And I'm just going to show you some of the condition issues and sort of a before and after conservation. Again, because you probably will have paintings within your collection, and you might want to see some of the aspects of deterioration that is quite common in historic paintings. So this is the before. Can I get the next slide? This is out of its historic frame. You can see that it's quite dirty, and there's a good deal of paint loss and a lot of undulation of the historic canvas on the wooden frame. Can I get next shot? This is some of the damage at the edge where the tacks were applied to hold the canvas to the stretcher bars, to the wooden stretcher bars, and a good deal of damage or deterioration to the canvas. Now, in this case, the canvas is quite brittle. There's a good degree of dry rot where the actual linen fibers themselves are starting to crack and deteriorate. Changes in temperature and humidity has allowed the canvas to move, and that moving differently than the paint film has caused this cracking, sometimes referred to as alligatoring. But again, it's the environment has accelerated some of the deterioration to this particular piece. The canvas was very, very desiccated and very, very deteriorated, and was no longer supporting itself in the frame. Next shot, please. This is just some other condition issues where there are a series of holes and tears, paint loss, and this cracking, again, where the canvas substrate is moving through time with changes in temperature and humidity, and the paint is not reacting in the same fashion and causing this lifting or cracking, and sometimes loss, which is that sort of white wedge-like shape. Next, please. Oh, very good. This again is referred to as tenting, where the paint has lifted away from the canvas substrate. On the image to your left, it's completely lost in that circular area, exposing the gesso ground, the substrate gesso ground to the paint itself. This is an oil painting with a historic varnish coating, and you can see all of these horizontal bands of deterioration of the paint layer, following the weave structure of the canvas. So the weave and had dimensional changes to the canvas, which relates directly to the damage on the surface of the paint. Next, please. This is abrasion. Both of these slides are showing loss of the varnish, exposing the paint. This has to do with improper handling and or hanging of the piece. This hung in a historic building on a stairwell with a lot of foot traffic, people just kind of passing by or touching the painting through time, or just workmen working in the space. But there's been a fair amount of mishandling of the piece. Next slide, please. You can see that there's a lot of undulation and deformity to the canvas right above the inscription up by the artist's name and date. So again, this means that there's been slippage of the canvas off of the historic stretcher bars, which is something quite common, and you may have this in your own collections where the wooden stretcher bars have either deteriorated, they've warped through time because wood also reacts to temperature and humidity, and they have moved slightly, and the canvas has separated or has moved independently of the stretcher bar, and then you get these sort of puckering or undulation on the surface. Next slide, please. Very pronounced up here at the top where it is pulled away from the stretcher bar and is not properly supported at all, and you get these sort of bubbling out or sort of belly forms where the canvas itself has sagged dramatically up in the corner and is just sort of deformed both the paint and the canvas. Next slide, please. Um, this is cleaning, and why I laugh a bit is this controversial cleaning technique that people ask me about all the time. That is this effective, and should I really carry it out? This is spit cleaning, and this is a very large painting, extremely large. It is 5 feet by 6 feet, roughly. It may be 4 and 9 and 5 and something, but basically 5 by 6. So if you can imagine, I spit cleaned this, and that's a lot of spit, but it works very, very well. I can recommend it as a technique if people have paintings that they want to clean beyond dusting. We talked a little bit last time about using Swiffers, the very soft yellow Swiffer dusters are quite effective and very appropriate. You don't want to use the scented ones because those are carry an oil with them. But if you just lightly dust paintings that are not under glass and just have a varnish coating or even a raw paint film, dusting periodically with things like a Swiffer duster or a microfiber cloth, if you don't apply too much pressure, can be extremely effective on cleaning a canvas. But if you do want to remove dirt and grime on a painting, you really can't get into trouble spit cleaning. Sometimes we use different solvents, or we use soaps and detergents. I would not recommend, unless someone went through some conservation training, to utilize those types of materials. unless discussed with a conservator. There are some very benign, very sympathetic soaps. Last time I discussed Orvis, which is sold at places like Tractor Supply and used for livestock to wash cows and other animals. So that's a very, very mild detergent. So if someone wanted to do some cleaning, you could, but I would then still highly recommend seeking out a professional to ask if that's appropriate, because you don't want to remove material like paint or other coatings, and sometimes a soap or a detergent can activate that. But spit cleaning can be quite effective and doesn't really pose any damage. So you can sort of see up in the clouds, the close-up of the difference between the dark area and the light area, and that patch on the left side where we've really begun cleaning. Now, I'm going to show you photos of the next step that we did in conservation, but you can see that even spit cleaning this brought back a lot of the blues and some of the purples and grays in the sky that were obscured by just dirt and grime. And sometimes older paintings may also have smoke damage from people smoking cigarettes and cigars and what have you that build up and accrete on the surface of the varnish. So this was just one way of removing some of that material. Next slide, please. So you can sort of see in the larger where the tree image is, below is the spit cleaned area, and what we're actually doing at the top for this client is we're removing the varnish. So this is a technique that I would not recommend anyone that is not trained as a conservator to carry out. I don't know why we jumped back. Can I go one forward? Ah, thanks. So this is done with a series of, done with a series of solvents and gels that keep the material on the surface, and we're just slowly, systematically removing the varnish. But you can sort of see that we've brought back the whites to the clouds and the green of the trees and the blue, that we're slowly stripping away that old varnish that has been deteriorated, degraded, and really quite dirty. But keep in mind that spit cleaning did do a good deal of cleaning and removing of the debris and dirt on the surface. So many times we just stop there at a basic cleaning, and I don't do the varnish removal. It depends on the object, and it depends on the client and what they really want to um, have as an end result. Can I get the next slide, please? This is just also showing some of the alligatoring and the tinting of the paint. We've actually started a process of relining, where you'll see that's a new linings canvas on the back, because this had so many holes, tears, and deterioration. We actually had to reline this painting. So that hole at the bottom in the one image is actually now, you can see behind, that's a new piece of linen that has been fused with an adhesive to the back of the canvas to hold the whole piece together and to re-level the surface. So some of that tinted paint has been pulled back down onto the surface of the canvas through a heat and pressure technique. Next slide, please. So this is just the before and after. We ended up relining this particular piece again because there was so much damage, and the historic canvas was so brittle and deteriorated that it would not be able to support itself. We then restretched the new canvas with the painting back out onto refurbished wooden stretchers. And in this case, the client chose to do a reproduction frame and not use the historic frame. The historic one was gilded with 22 karat gold, and there were many sections missing. You can see areas of loss up at the top. They did not want to invest in a conservation project to repair the frame, to fill in the areas of loss. So they kept the frame historically, but we just went with a reproduction, and I think it's close. It's not as grand as the original, but it more or less does the same visual impact of a large overbuilt frame. So that's just that particular project. I think that's sort of it for paintings. If you can go to the next slide. Again, if there's any burning question, or we can open it up after, I'm just going to talk about photographs, and then we can open it all up for discussion. And if you have particular objects in your collection that you want to discuss, or anything that I've showed you perks interest on techniques or materials, what have you, will do. But this last section is just on photographs. Most what you'll see here in the PowerPoint are photos that were improperly housed or damaged. Like in this instance, there was some material splattered on the surface, and after cleaning, that's an after. So again, I'm not a huge fan of some of the archival binders for photographs or bins. Sometimes they'll sell cardboard boxes, and you'll have boxes within boxes, and the photo or slide or what have you is either vertical or horizontal but standing. I'm not a huge fan of that system, but again, all of these decisions have to be made through the lens of your institution and space requirements, and certainly cost, because many of these systems are very, very expensive. So I get it, and you just have to do what you can to preserve the collection in the best way that you can. So that being said, if the only thing that you can do is sort of vertical storage between things like either glassine or the other thing you can use are mylar sheets to separate between several images, but you want something between your photos. You don't want to stack them up against each other. If you have the opportunity to do flat file storage, I prefer that. I think it also allows you to be much more focused on how to support the piece, so you can actually create trays or cardboard, acid-free or archival board backing where the photo can lay on top of, so you can kind of create a support system. What I see in photographs most of the time is just improper handling. So edges are lost, paper is damaged or torn due to the fact of improper handling, or in many cases, improper exhibition where it's not properly framed or it's not properly supported. Can I get the next photo? Here again, this is just another one which was heavily damaged by improper supporting of the photo. And again, that's why I tend to lean against these sort of stacked boxes or binders to hold photos, because they don't give enough of a rigid support from the back, and then you get creasing and folds. Some of the historic papers or cardboards that were used were not acid free, and although the emulsion may not be causing deterioration, the inherent vice of the cardboard or paper having acids in it, becoming more brittle, that's where you get these sort of tears and folds to photographs. Next slide. Even more contemporary photos from something, say, of the 1950s or 60s, improper storage, they will react to humidity and temperature as well as any other object. So you can get warping and dimensional changes to the photo, which directly impact the emulsion that's on the surface. So most of the photos that I'm showing you, except for this one color piece, is a silver nitrate emulsion. Some of the pieces are actually manufactured. That the emulsion is in a egg binder, so those photos tend to get this dark amber color through age. They're very photosensitive. Again, in proper storage, they'll fade. The emulsion may crack, similar to the way the painting did, where the substrate, the paper, and the emulsion in this case are reacting differently, like the canvas and the paper, the canvas and the paint. So the emulsion and the paper is the same way, where it can distort or cause cracks. Next slide, please. Sort of the epitome of improper storage, where the paper is so brittle that you've lost a good deal of the photo. To, I guess, put this in context, this is my mother, circa 1926, I think, or 28, as a little girl. And even though she has a conservator for a son, she still does not like to keep her photographs in proper storage. So be mindful, it can even hit home. Last image, please. This is a little earlier. This is 1916. And again, in proper storage, we have very several cracks have formed. There's a lot of loss to the image. There are fingerprints that are now embedded into the emulsion on the far side by the little girl. And really, it's again, it all comes down to improper handling of these types of pieces. There are many companies that provide conservation of photographs, and a great deal can be done. So they're not lost causes. It's just, I really have to emphasize, the big thing is how to properly handle gloves, wearing gloves, proper support. Something like this I would keep on a tray. If it was an archival board, something to maneuver or manipulate if I'm working with the photograph, so that you're not handling it or over handling it. It might be a good venture to digitize some of your early photographs. That way you make them available to the public. You can also reprint from a digital scan and maintain and archive your photos without exhibiting or overhandling. So there's lots of small institutions are beginning digitizing of their collections, and that way they can get them back out onto the web, and people don't have to handle their collections. So if it's possible, that's another avenue that you might want to look into. Again, for full disclosure, that's my grandmother and her brother from 1906. So I think that's it. I think we can move on to any kind of discussion. This is just, again, I mentioned these organizations. I did this last time. Very good resources. Alliance for Response. We really didn't talk too much about disaster recovery, but it's an area that I think is critical for small institutions or county institutions to have a disaster recovery plan or a disaster preparedness plan. As part of that plan, to have vendors or individuals identified that can provide services. For instance, with photographs, disaster recovery, it's critical. If you have a water damage, it's critical to get those materials worked on as quickly as possible. They can be dried, they can be freeze dried, they can be treated by a conservation firm or individual. Mold starts to grow within 48 hours of exposure to water. That's something that, if that's a concern within your disaster recovery plan, some institutions are more susceptible to floodwaters. Some institutions are more susceptible to fire in an old structure, what have you. Those are all risk assessments that you can carry out as part of your plan, and identifying individuals and resources that you can go to. Where, a scenario, where can I go on a weekend to get archival materials? How quickly can I get archival board? Who in the area has services to do rapid freezing for freeze drying if you had an event, or if you had pests, if you had insect and you had an outbreak of a swarm of insects, and where do I go for those types of individuals to identify a insect, or to come up with a plan to carry out pest abatement. So all of those things should be within your disaster plan. And it's good to be proactive and have all that in place. So when you get the phone call at 4 a.m, you know how to hit the ground running and deal with those sort of situations. So I guess at this point we can certainly open it up, and I hope that some of the things I showed you will bring up some discussion on your own collections.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, I have a question from Rutherford Hall. Most of our collection is photographs and documents. And my question is, a lot of the photographs have curled up. You know what I mean? And,
I do.
Okay, so number one, how would I go about can I try and flatten them? Or am I going to damage them if I flatten them? And then how do I keep them flat?
They can be flattened. I would recommend that for flattening photos, you would seek out a conservator that would do it, because it has, pardon me, it has to be done very, very slowly,
I was just going to say gradually.
so that you're easing the paper you're softening up, you're allowing those fibers within the paper to relax. Otherwise, if it's done too quickly, you're going to tear the
Right.
emulsion and you're going to get cracks. So I would try to store them horizontally if you
Yeah.
can.
That's what I
And
do.
and then if you can seek out somebody to do some rehumidification and blocking. I wouldn't try to force them yourself.
Okay. That's my question, so thanks.
Sure.
I think she's more of an oil painting. Conservator, yeah. That's it for me. I'm done.
Cool. Okay, great. Hi. Oh, there you go.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Christine Beagle from Blairstown Historic Preservation Committee. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for all your information. It's really great. I do have a couple questions, which I am sorry I had to start attending late, but maybe you did go over this. But could you just advise what the ideal temperature and humidity is for, general storage of paper?
If you can store your paper at 50% humidity or a little bit under 50% humidity, between 40 and 50. 50 is your ideal number for paper. You don't want it to go higher than 55 is your top end. I would not want to see paper going higher than 55%.
It's 87% humidity.
Ideally, between 45 and 50 is
Okay.
your range that you would be best at. And for temperature, you want to hold things at maybe 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
So a little bit drier air for paper is lower humidity is a little bit better. You don't want to go too low because you don't want things to desiccate and become brittle. But the sweet spot is 50.
Okay, sweet spot is 50. Okay. Okay. And then, thank you for that. We do have a couple of projects that we're working on. We had a donation of, this is a totally away from your beautiful portraits that you showed the restoration of, but we had an iconic sign from our main street, like a shingle sign that was donated to us. It was a 5 and 10 cent store that we had that is really in quite a few photos, and people recognize it right away. But of course, I wish I could tell you what the paint was used on there. I do have somebody from my group who could tell you in a second. But at any rate, we have it. It is starting to flake a little bit. And I wanted to ask you, is there something we can do to just seal it now so that there wouldn't be any additional flaking going on until we could have it, restored? And maybe whatever sealant we use at the time could then be lifted, and so that a professional could work on it at a later time.
There are many different techniques to keep the paint from detaching. I would say, I don't know if you know this part because that my address for the business is in Belvedere, but I don't know if you knew I live in Blairstown.
Oh, okay. Hi.
So I'm from Blairstown.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to shoot me a photograph.
Okay.
Beyond this webinar, I would say the first thing is to, if you can, store it horizontally. Don't have it vertically.
All right. It's a double-sided sign, I should say that.
Oh, okay. Well, that certainly complicates it even more. So,
yeah.
It would be difficult for me to recommend. There's no easy, spray something on or coat it with something. But if you shoot me an email with just a couple of photos, that's the email's right on the screen. If you send me
okay.
that, I'd be more than happy to just look at the piece and sort of help advise you of it. And or at some point, if you want me to just stop downtown, I'm more than happy to do that as well.
Yeah, we're actually part of Blairstown government, so we're at the
Uh-huh.
municipal building.
Yeah. So
Yeah, okay, that would be great. Because, yeah, then we did have another question about newspapers that we have that, or we have either acquired many or will be acquiring more, and just, proper restoration for that. We've already had someone to come look at that because they are in quite a disarray as far as crumbling is concerned. In some cases, it's really ironic because the oldest ones seem to be the best condition. It's the mid-century ones that are really having the most trouble. And I don't know why that was. They were newspapers that were at one time, Bearstown Press newspaper,
uh-huh.
and for whatever reason, the different storage positioning or whatever. It's just kind of interesting that the oldest ones happen to be in the best condition. So I'd want to find out, anything you would need to know about how to go about doing that. I forget the name of the company. It was up in New Hampshire, I think it was. I'd have to remember the name. It's been a couple years since we met with them. But yeah, we're in the process of trying to be stored so that we can get them photographed and digitized. They were digitized once by the library, but it was a long time ago. And I'll tell you, it was just a terrible, it was probably the good technology at the time. Let me just say
Right.
that, in the 90s. But the photos are blacked out. A lot of the wording is blurry. I mean, it's just so disheartening when you finally get that date that something was supposed to happen, and then you go and you find it, and then because in their digital archives, the library anyway, that page could be 50% blacked out. The photos for sure are probably blacked out. So you end up getting like a want when you finally get to that one page where that article happened or that event was reported on or whatever. So, okay,
Right.
yeah, that's
There,
kind of an upcoming
there
thing
is a
for us.
there is a product called WeTow, and I'm not sure how to spell it.
Okay.
If you contact me with those other images, I can look it up. You can get it at a company called Talas, Talas,
Okay.
and they're online. That's a product that you can apply to newspaper. And
Mm-hmm.
what it does is, the problem with newspaper, and maybe the difference between why some are less reactive and others are more reactive, is the rag to paper pulp ratio.
Right.
So some may be more acidic, and then they get very, very brittle. So
Mm-hmm.
the WeTow is a spray that you can actually apply. It might be something to utilize. I mean, you could go through like a company that will do a full-on acidification, where they actually
Right.
soak the acids out of the newspaper. They'll do an
Right.
extraction. The WeTow works pretty well. What it is it's just an alkaline base in a spray can, in a propellant, and you spray both sides of the newspaper and let it dry. And that calcium carbonate that's in the spray neutralizes some
Okay.
of the acid in the paper. So you could, that's something you could maybe look into or think about if you're not able to send a lot of pieces out for deacidification, or you want to try it on one particular piece. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And
Great.
then even just for digitization, sometimes I find that large format photographs are actually much better than scanning. So
Okay.
you
Right
get more.
now, as we need, and if we have, been photographing, but not as a complete collection. You know, we do it kind of like as we find an article that we need, then of course we photograph that. And then, but you know, as far as the complete collection, that's still something that's in our future. So
Sure, sure.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, good.
I didn't know you were our neighbor.
Yes, yep, yep. Anybody else, or I don't know if we have. I don't know.
400. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if you have any questions,
I-
you got
Okay,
my
I took your
email address.
contact. We really
Yes.
appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
All right.
good.
Thank you, everyone, for
All right.
participating. We are
We'll
really
talk
appreciative.
soon.
We'll talk soon.
Good, good. Be well.
Bye-bye. Stay well. Stay well.
Yeah.
I'm trying to stop the recording. I figure out how to do it.
All
Technology.
right. Take care, Gina.
All right, hold on. All right, thank you.